She was lying in a hospital bed, contractions ripping through her body every 90 seconds, sweat pouring down her temples, her fingers white-knuckled around the metal railing, and somewhere across town, in a mahogany-paneled office that smelled of old leather and expensive cologne, her husband was signing papers that would erase her from his life entirely. He didn't know that the woman sitting across the desk from him, the lawyer helping him rewrite every clause, every line, every single provision of his last will and testament, was the same woman who had once held his wife's hair back in a dormitory bathroom during freshman year, the same woman who had been a maid of honor, the same woman who had promised, on a rain-soaked graduation day, that she would always have her back. This is the story of how a man tried to destroy his pregnant wife on the worst night of her life. Now the one person he trusted to help him do it was the one person who would make sure he never got away with it. If you think you know how this ends, I promise you don't. Her name was Claire Whitfield, and before she became Mrs. Claire Ashford, she was the kind of woman people underestimated, not because she was weak, not because she was simple, but because she was quiet. She had a way of entering a room without shifting the energy, of smiling through conversations that would have broken other people, of absorbing pain like a sponge, absorbs water silently, completely, and without anyone noticing, until it was far too late. Claire grew up in a small town just outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. Her father was a mechanic who worked 6 days a week and came home with engine grease permanently stained under his fingernails. Her mother was a school librarian who smelled like old paper and lavender and who taught Claire to read before she could tie her own shoes. They weren't poor, but they weren't comfortable either. Every dollar had a job. Every meal was planned. Christmas gifts were wrapped in newspaper some years, and Claire learned early that wanting things and having things were two very different realities. But Claire was brilliant, not the loud kind of brilliant, not the hand-raising answer shouting kind. She was the kind of brilliant that showed up on paper, in exam scores that made her teachers do double takes, in essays that her English professor once called the most emotionally intelligent work I've read in 20 years of teaching. She earned a full scholarship to Duke University. And when she packed her bags and kissed her parents goodbye in the driveway of their small clapboard house, her mother held her face in both hands and said, "The world is going to try to make you small, Claire, don't you let it." She carried those words like armor. She carried them through the long bus ride to Durham, through the terrifying first night in a dorm room that smelled like industrial cleaner and someone else's perfume, through the first lecture in a hall so large she felt like a grain of sand at the bottom of an ocean. Those words became the spine of every decision she made, every risk she took, every moment she chose to stay when everything in her wanted to run down at Duke. Claire studied finance. She was meticulous, analytical, and had a gift for seeing patterns in numbers that other people missed. But it was during her first week on campus that she met the person who would become the most important relationship of her life. And no, it wasn't her future husband. It was her roommate, a wild-haired, fast-talking, fearless woman named Danielle Reyes. Danielle was everything Claire was not. Loud where Claire was quiet. Reckless where Claire was cautious. Confrontational where Claire was conciliatory. She came from a family of lawyers in Miami, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had the kind of laugh that could fill a lecture hall. They were an unlikely pair, but from the very first night when Danielle dragged Claire to a campus mixer, and Claire ended up debating economic policy with a visiting professor so fiercely that a small crowd gathered, they became inseparable. Danielle later said that was the moment she knew Claire was special. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Danielle would tell people years later, at dinner parties, at brunches, anytime someone asked how they'd met. She just believed what she believed, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Do you know how rare that is? A person who doesn't perform. I fell in love with her brain that night, and I never recovered. For 4 years they were each other's anchor. Danielle held Claire when she got the call that her father had suffered a heart attack. Claire sat with Danielle through 3 failed relationships and 1 spectacular law school rejection that eventually turned into an acceptance at Georgetown. They studied together, cried together, laughed until they couldn't breathe together. And on graduation day, standing in the rain because the outdoor ceremony refused to be moved, Danielle grabbed Claire's hand and said, "No matter what happens, no matter where we end up, I've got you. Always." Demented. Both of them, life, as it tends to do, pulled them in different directions. Claire moved to Charlotte and began working at a mid-sized financial consulting firm. Danielle went to Washington, then eventually settled in Charlotte herself after landing a position at a prestigious law firm that specialized in estate planning and family law. They saw each other less, but the thread between them never broke. Brunch on Sundays when they could manage it, long phone calls on Tuesday nights, a friendship that had calcified into something unbreakable. And then Claire met Dominic Ashford. Dominic was the kind of man who entered a room and rearranged the gravity in it. He was tall, 6'3", with dark hair that was always perfectly styled, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood symmetry on a molecular level, and eyes that were so blue they almost didn't look real. He wore suits that cost more than Claire's monthly rent and drove a car that made valets nervous. He was the CEO of Ashford Development Group, a commercial real estate empire that his father had built and that Dominic had expanded into something worth, by most estimates, somewhere north of $300 million. He was, by every metric that society uses to measure a man, exceptional. Forbes had profiled him at 32. Business Insider called him the most compelling real estate mind of his generation. Women at cocktail parties whispered his name like it was a password to something exclusive. He was single, and the fact that he was single seemed to genuinely confuse people, as though a man with that much money and that face couldn't possibly be without a partner unless he was choosing to be, he noticed. Claire at a charity gala, she was there because her firm had bought a table. She was wearing a dress she'd found on sale, a simple black number that she'd hemmed herself because it was 2 inches too long. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She was standing near the bar, reading the event program like it was a novel, and Dominic walked over and said, "You're the only person in this room who actually looks interested in what this charity does." She looked up at him, unimpressed, and said, "You're the only person in this room who's had 3 glasses of champagne and hasn't donated yet." He laughed. Really laughed. And something in that moment cracked open a door that should have stayed shut. Their courtship was fast, too fast, Danielle said. "It's been 3 months. Claire, 3 months. You don't even buy a car in 3 months without doing research." Claire had laughed and told her she was being overprotective, but Danielle's instincts were buzzing like a fire alarm in an empty building, and she couldn't explain why. Something about the speed. Something about the way Dominic always seemed to know exactly what to say, as if he had studied Claire like a market to be captured rather than a person to be loved. Within 3 months, Dominic had swept Claire into his world like a current pulling a swimmer out to sea. Penthouse dinners, weekend trips to places Claire had only seen in magazines, a closet full of clothes she hadn't asked for but that appeared in garment bags on her bed. He was charming, attentive, and relentless. He told her she was the most intelligent woman he'd ever met. He told her she was different from everyone else. He told her he couldn't imagine his life without her. And Claire, who had spent her entire life being careful, who had built walls out of caution and common sense, let him in. Because he made her feel seen. Because for the first time in her life, someone with power was using that power to lift her up instead of push her down. They were married within a year. A massive wedding at the Ashford family estate, a sprawling property in the hills outside Asheville with more rooms than Claire could count. Danielle was the maid of honor, of course. She stood next to Claire in a sapphire dress and held her, okayed doing the vows and smiled, but if you looked closely, and Claire was too in love to look closely, you could see something behind Danielle's eyes, not jealousy, something closer to worry. Because Danielle had done what Danielle always did. She'd researched, she'd asked questions, she'd dug into Dominic Ashford's history with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that charm was often the first weapon of a dangerous man. And what she'd found wasn't criminal. It wasn't scandalous in the tabloid sense, but it was enough to make her stomach tighten. Dominic had a pattern. Before Claire, there had been 2 other serious relationships, both with women who came from modest backgrounds, both of whom had been showered with attention and luxury in the beginning, and both of whom had left the relationship with nothing. Not because they hadn't earned anything, but because Dominic had structures in place, legal structures, financial structures, family structures that ensured the Ashford wealth never left the Ashford name, prenuptial agreements that were ironclad, trusts that were impenetrable, a family lawyer who had been with the Ashfords for decades, and who treated every woman in Dominic's life as a potential threat to be neutralized. Danielle tried to warn Claire. She did it gently, over wine on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before the wedding. She said, "I just want you to have your own lawyer look at the prenup, that's all. Just have someone independent review it." Claire had smiled and said, "Danielle, I'm not marrying him for his money. I don't care about the prenup." And Danielle, who loved Claire more than almost anyone in the world, bit her tongue and hoped she was wrong. She was it wrong though. The first year of marriage was beautiful on the surface. They traveled, they entertained. Claire left her job at Dominic's insistence. He said he wanted her to enjoy life without the stress of work. She resisted at first. She loved her work. She was good at it. Her supervisor had hinted at a promotion, track that could lead to a vice president title within 5 years. But Dominic was persuasive. He always was. He had a way of framing things so that refusal felt ungrateful, not through anger, never through anger, but through a wounded bewilderment that made Claire feel like she was being unreasonable for wanting something outside of him. "You freedom," he said. Most women would kill for this, and the implication, left unsaid but felt like a bruise, was that if she didn't want what he was offering, something was wrong with her. And slowly, so slowly that Claire didn't even feel it happening, the walls of her new life began to close. It started with small things. Dominic would make comments about her clothes, not cruel comments, not at first, but steering ones. "You'd look better in something more fitted. That color washes you out." Then it was her friends. He never said she couldn't see them. He just always had something planned when she tried. A dinner with investors, a weekend at the lake house, a last-minute trip. Gradually, the brunches with Danielle became monthly instead of weekly. The Tuesday phone calls became shorter. Claire's world shrank, and she didn't even realize it because Dominic had filled every empty space with himself by the time they'd been married 2 years. Claire's life revolved entirely around Dominic, his schedule, his preferences, his moods. She managed the household, a staff of 4, a social calendar that required spreadsheets, and a husband whose expectations shifted like sand. Some days he was the man she'd fallen in love with, warm, funny, attentive. Other days he was cold, dismissive. He'd look at her across the dinner table like she was a stranger who had wandered into his house uninvited. His mother visited every Sunday. Victoria would walk through the penthouse with a proprietary air, running her finger along surfaces to check for dust, commenting on the flower arrangements, subtly rearranging things Claire had placed. She never complimented Claire. She complimented the apartment, the decor, the view, things that belonged to Dominic. Claire was treated like a curator of someone else's museum, present to maintain the beauty but never to claim it. Claire began to feel a loneliness so profound it was almost physical. It lived in her chest like a stone. She would stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, 40 stories above the city, watching the tiny people below moving through their lives, and feel as though she was watching the world from inside a glass cage, beautiful, comfortable, suffocating. And as she got pregnant, she found out on a Tuesday morning, alone in the bathroom of their penthouse, 2 pink lines on a plastic stick. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and cried, not from sadness, but from a hope so fierce it frightened her. A baby, a family, something that was hers, something that no amount of money or power or control could take away. She sat there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, just breathing, feeling the enormity of it settle into her body like the first warm day after a long winter. She placed both hands on her stomach, flat still, unchanged, hiding its miracle, and whispered, or am I working it?" The words came out broken and beautiful, and she let herself cry until there was nothing left. She told Dominic that evening. She'd planned it carefully, his favorite dinner, candles, the good wine that she wouldn't be drinking. She placed the positive test in a small box and slid it across the table like a gift. He opened it, and he stared at it, and for a moment, one perfect, crystalline moment, his face broke open with something that looked like genuine joy. He stood up, came around the table, and held her face in his hands. "We're going to be a family," he said, and she believed. But joy, in Dominic's world, came with conditions. For exactly 9 days, Dominic was the man Claire had married. He brought her breakfast in bed. He read aloud from a baby name book, doing ridiculous voices for each entry that made her laugh, until her sides hurt. He held her at night with a tenderness that felt almost sacred. 9 days. Claire would remember each of them with a clarity that hurt, because they were the last good days. The last days, she believed, and then on the 10th day the dynamic shifted. Dominic became obsessively controlling. He insisted Claire see only the doctors. He chose a private OB/GYN who reported to him. He monitored her diet, her exercise, her sleep. He installed cameras in the house that he claimed were for security. He reduced her access to their joint accounts, explaining that he was restructuring their finances for the baby's future. He began referring to the child as my heir in conversations with his family, as though Claire were merely the vessel carrying his legacy. And his mother, Victoria Ashford, the woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes and whose opinion of Claire had always been a thin veneer of politeness over deep contempt, became a constant presence. She moved into the guest wing of the penthouse. She accompanied Claire to doctor's appointments. She chose the nursery colors, the baby clothes, the name, not suggested, chose. And when Claire tried to push back, tried to assert that this was her child too, Victoria would look at her with that frozen smile and say, "Of course, dear, but we want what's best for the baby, don't we?" Claire felt it happening, the slow erosion of herself. The way her opinions became suggestions that were politely ignored. The way her name on documents began to disappear, replaced by Dominic's or the family trust's. The way her husband looked at her belly with a proprietary hunger that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. There was one particular evening, Claire would never forget it, when she suggested the name Lily for the baby if it was a girl. She'd always loved that name. Her grandmother's name was Lillian, and it felt like a thread connecting the baby to Claire's own history, her own people. Dominic looked at her across the dinner table with an expression that could have frozen lava. "Ashfords, don't use common names," he said. His mother, seated at the other end of the table like a presiding judge, nodded approvingly. "The baby's name will come from the family registry," Victoria added. "There's a tradition to uphold." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but Dominic had already turned back to his plate and the conversation was over. The name Lily was never mentioned again. She called Danielle one night, 4 months into the pregnancy. It was late past midnight, and her voice was so small that Danielle almost didn't recognize it. "I think I made a mistake," Claire whispered. Danielle didn't say "I told you so." She didn't say anything for a long moment. And then, with the steady calm of a woman who had spent years arguing cases in front of judges who didn't want to listen, she said, "Tell me everything." And Claire did. She told her about the financial restructuring that she hadn't been consulted on, about the prenuptial agreement that she now realized she'd never fully understood, about the cameras, the controlled appointments, the who treated her like hired help, about the way Dominic's affection had become conditional warm when she complied, ice cold when she questioned Art. Danielle listened to every word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp or say, "Oh my God," or do any of the things people do when they're performing sympathy. She listened the way she listened in courtrooms, completely, systematically, cataloging every detail, filing every fact, in a mental architecture that was already beginning to look like a legal strategy. And when Claire was done, when she was crying so quietly that the sound was almost swallowed by the phone's static, Danielle said something that would change the course of everything. "I need you to trust me, Claire. I need you to trust me the way you did when we were 18 and stupid and thought we could take on the world. Can you do that?" Claire said yes. What Danielle didn't tell Claire, not yet, not until the time was right, was that she had recently been recruited by the very law firm that handled the Ashford family's estate, Peterson, Harley, and Whitmore, one of the oldest and most prestigious firms in Charlotte. They'd approached her because her reputation in estate law had grown formidable, and they needed someone with her expertise. She hadn't known, when she accepted the position, that the Ashford account would end up on her desk. But life has a way of arranging coincidences that feel like fate. Danielle was now, officially, one of the attorneys with access to the Ashford family trust documents. She had seen the prenuptial agreement in its entirety, all 42 pages of it, plus the addendums that had been filed after the wedding, addendums that Claire had never seen and almost certainly had never been told about. She had seen the trust structures, the asset allocations, the provisions that had been put in place long before Claire ever entered the picture, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The prenup that Claire had signed, the one she'd dismissed as unimportant because she wasn't marrying Dominic for his money, was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. It had been drafted by the Ashford family's longtime attorney, a man named Gerald Whitmore, senior partner at the firm, and it was designed to do one thing: ensure that if the marriage ended for any reason, Claire would leave with virtually nothing. No alimony beyond a token amount, no claim to any property acquired during the marriage, no stake in the family trust, and this was the part that made Danielle's hands shake when she read it. No guaranteed custodial rights if the couple had children. The agreement contained a clause, buried in page 37 of a 42-page document, that stated custodial arrangements would be subject to the determination of the Ashford Family Trust Board, which was composed entirely of Dominic's family members. Claire had signed away her rights to her own children before she'd even had them. And she had no idea. Danielle began to plan, quietly, carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that you don't beat people like the Ashfords by being loud. You beat them by being smarter. You beat them by being patient. You beat them by letting them believe they've already won and then pulling the ground out from under their feet, so fast they don't even realize they're falling until they hit the bottom. She started meeting Claire in secret, not at restaurants too risky, too visible. They met at a public library in a part of town where neither of them would be recognized. They sat in the reference section, surrounded by old encyclopedias and the comfortable anonymity of books. And Danielle walked Claire through what she'd found. She explained the prenuptial agreement in language that stripped away the legal jargon and revealed its true nature, a trap. She explained the trust structure, the modifications, the systematic erosion of Claire's rights. She explained it all, with the calm authority of a surgeon explaining an operation. Here is what's wrong, here's what we're going to do about it, and here is why it's going to work. Claire listened. She asked questions. She took notes in the same careful handwriting she'd used to take notes in college. And for the first time in years, she felt something other than loneliness or fear. She felt the first faint stirrings of power, not Dominic's kind of power, not the kind that comes from money or control or the ability to make people afraid. Real power, the kind that comes from knowing the truth and deciding what to do with it. Months passed. Claire's pregnancy progressed, and with it, the tension in the Ashford household thickened, like smoke. Dominic became increasingly distant, spending more nights at the office than at home. Claire noticed lipstick on a collar once, a shade she didn't own. She found a receipt for a restaurant she'd never been to, a table for two, a bottle of wine that cost $400. She said nothing. She had learned, by then, that confrontation with Dominic was like throwing stones at a fortress. The stones bounced off, and the fortress remembered. But she wasn't idle. Danielle had told her to start keeping records. Quietly, nothing obvious. Just a journal, a handwritten journal that she kept in a hollowed-out book on her nightstand. A copy of Wuthering Heights that Dominic would never touch because he didn't read fiction. In it, Claire documented everything. Dates, times, conversations, the financial statements. She'd managed a glimpse before they were locked away. The camera footage she'd learned to download to a hidden cloud drive. The text messages she'd screenshotted on the rare occasions Dominic left his phone unlocked. She was building a case. She didn't know it yet, not fully. She thought she was just keeping track for her own sanity. She thought she was just trying to hold on to reality in a house that kept trying to rewrite it. But Danielle knew. Danielle saw every journal entry, every screenshot, every piece of evidence as another brick in a wall that would eventually be tall enough and strong enough to protect Claire from everything that was coming. Danielle was orchestrating this like a chess game played across months, and Claire was not her pawn. Claire was her queen, the most powerful piece on the board. She just didn't know it yet, at 7 months pregnant. Claire made a discovery that changed everything. She was in Dominic's home office, a room she rarely entered because he kept it locked, looking for a folder of insurance documents that she needed for the baby's medical file. The door had been left unlocked, a rare oversight by a man who controlled every detail of his environment. She found the insurance folder quickly, but next to it, in a drawer that was slightly ajar, she found something else. A second phone. It was a cheap prepaid phone, the kind you buy at a gas station, completely out of character for a man who used only the latest technology. Claire's hands trembled as she picked it up and pressed the power button. The screen lit up. No password. The messages were between Dominic and a woman named Serena. They spanned months. They were explicit in some places, tender in others, and devastating throughout. But it wasn't the affair itself that nearly brought Claire to her knees. It was a message from 3 weeks earlier. Dominic had written, "Once the baby is born, I'll move forward with the divorce. Gerald is adjusting the trust provisions. She won't get a dime, and the custody clause in the prenup gives us everything. My mother is already preparing the nursery at the estate. Claire will be out of the picture within 6 months." Serena had responded with a heart emoji and the words, "I can't wait to be a family, our family." Claire stood in that office, 8 months pregnant, holding a cheap phone that contained the blueprint for her own destruction, and she did not cry. She did not scream. She did not throw the phone against the wall. She took photographs of every single message. She put the phone back exactly where she'd found it. She closed the drawer. She left the office. She locked the door behind her using the spare key she'd had made months ago, another quiet act of self-preservation that Danielle had suggested. And then she called Danielle. I found it, she said. Her voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. I found everything. Danielle was quiet for a moment, then she said, good, now we move. What happened next unfolded over the space of 3 weeks, and it happened so quietly that Dominic Ashford never felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Danielle, from her position inside Peterson, Halley and Whitmore, began a careful audit of the Ashford Family Trust. She had legitimate access to these documents as part of her professional duties. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions and revealed new ones. The trust had been modified multiple times over the past year, each modification reducing Claire's provisions and increasing the control mechanisms available to Dominic and his mother. But the modifications had been done hastily, and Gerald Whitmore, who was approaching 70 and whose attention to detail had been declining for years, had made errors. Significant errors. Errors that, in the hands of a skilled attorney, could be used to challenge the entire structure. Danielle also discovered something that Dominic didn't know she knew. The prenuptial agreement, for all its complexity, had a fatal flaw. North Carolina law requires that both parties have independent legal counsel review a prenuptial agreement for it to be considered fully enforceable. Claire had not had independent counsel. She had been told, by Dominic, that our family lawyer will handle everything. Gerald Whitmore had represented both parties, which was a textbook conflict of interest. The prenup was, in all likelihood, voidable, but Danielle didn't tip her hand. Not yet. She needed one more thing. She needed Dominic to do exactly what she suspected he was planning to do. She needed him to overreach, because in her experience, men like Dominic always overreach. Their arrogance was their undoing. You just had to give them enough rope. The rope came on the night of March 14th. Claire's water broke at 11:47 in the evening. She was alone in the penthouse. Dominic was at a dinner meeting that she knew meant he was with Serena. She called an ambulance, called her mother, and called Danielle, in that order. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. Her mother, who lived 2 hours away, got in the car immediately. Danielle said, I'll be at the hospital. Don't worry about anything except that baby. Claire was admitted to Mercy General at 12:15 in the morning. Her labor was progressing quickly. The contractions were intense, relentless. And she gripped the hand of a nurse named Rosa, who told her she was doing beautifully, that she was strong, that her baby was almost here. Dominic arrived at the hospital at 12:40. He walked into the delivery room with the performative concern of a man who had rehearsed his lines. He kissed Claire's forehead. He held her hand for approximately 4 minutes, and then his phone buzzed, and he stepped into the hallway to take the call. He didn't come back for 20 minutes, and he did. He told Claire he had a legal matter that needed his immediate attention. Estate business couldn't wait, he said. He'd be back before the baby came. He kissed her forehead again, that same rehearsed gesture, and he left. He drove across town. The streets were empty, that eerie, hollow emptiness that cities take on after midnight, when the only people moving are the ones with somewhere urgent to be or something urgent to hide. Dominic was both. He pulled into the underground garage of the Peterson, Halley and Whitmore building at 12:55. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. He straightened his tie in the rearview mirror. He looked at himself, really looked, and what he saw was a man in complete control, a man executing a plan. He had no idea that he was walking into the most catastrophic hour of his life. Gerald Whitmore was waiting for him, despite the hour, because Dominic had called Gerald 3 days earlier and told him to prepare a new version of his last will and testament. The current will left a significant portion of his personal assets separate from the family trust to Claire and any children of their marriage. Dominic wanted that changed. He wanted Claire removed entirely. He wanted everything, every stock, every property, every account to flow into the family trust. Controlled by the trust board, controlled by his mother, Claire would receive nothing, and the provisions for any children would be managed exclusively by the trust, with Victoria Ashford as the primary guardian in the event of Dominic's death or incapacity. He was erasing his wife from his own death. Provisions on the night she was giving birth to his child. Gerald Whitmore, who was old and tired and who had served the Ashford family for 40 years without ever questioning a directive, had the documents prepared. He'd been working on them. For 3 days, they were sitting on his desk, neat and precise, ready for signature. But Gerald Whitmore was not the only attorney in the office that night. Danielle Reyes was there. She had been working late, or so it appeared. In reality, she had been waiting. She had known this was coming. Not the exact night, but the general timeline. She had seen the communications between Dominic and Gerald in the firm's internal system. She had watched the document revisions in real time, tracked every change, every deletion, every addition. She knew what Dominic was planning, and she had been preparing her countermove for weeks. When Dominic walked into Gerald's office, Danielle was in the conference room next door. The walls were thin. She could hear everything. She heard Dominic say, "Is it ready?" She heard Gerald say, "Everything is in order. Just need your signature." She heard this scratch of a pen on paper, and then she heard something that Dominic hadn't planned for. She heard herself speak. She stepped into Gerald's doorway. She was calm. Her posture was straight. Her voice was level. She said, "Before you sign anything else, Mr. Ashford, I think there are a few things you should know." Dominic looked at her. He didn't recognize her, not at first. He'd met her only once, briefly, at the wedding. She'd been Claire's maid of honor, but to Dominic, she'd been background decoration. A woman in a sapphire dress holding a bouquet. He hadn't remembered her name then, and he didn't know it now. "Who are you?" he asked, with the dismissive tone of a man who wasn't used to being interrupted. "My name is Danielle Reyes. I'm an attorney at this firm, and I'm also your wife's best friend." The room went very still. The kind of still that happens before something breaks, like the air before a thunderstorm. Heavy and electric and waiting. Dominic's face went through a rapid series of transformations, confusion, recognition, irritation, and then something cold and calculating. He turned to Gerald. "What is she doing here?" Gerald, to his credit, looked genuinely surprised. He hadn't known about Danielle's connection to Claire. The firm was large, and Danielle had been careful to keep that information out of casual conversation that Danielle didn't wait for. Gerald to answer. She placed a folder on the table, a thick folder, the kind that makes a sound when it lands, that tells you there's weight inside it. Real weight. The kind of weight that ends careers and reshapes legacies and turns powerful men into cautionary tales. "This folder," she said, "contains several things that I think you'll find relevant. First, a complete record of every modification made to the Ashford Family Trust over the past 14 months, including modifications that were made without the knowledge or consent of your wife, who is a named beneficiary. Second, a legal analysis demonstrating that the prenuptial agreement between you and Claire Ashford is unenforceable under North Carolina General Statute 52B, due to the absence of independent legal counsel for the less advantaged party. Third, copies of communications between you and a woman named Serena Vance that document an ongoing extramarital affair, including messages in which you discuss plans to divorce your wife, strip her of custodial rights, and remove her from your estate. Plans that you are, apparently, attempting to execute tonight while she is in active labor at Mercy General Hospital." She paused. She'll let the silence fill the room like water filling a glass. "And fourth," she continued, "a formal complaint that I intend to file with the North Carolina State Bar against Gerald Whitmore for facilitating a conflict of interest in the drafting of the original prenuptial agreement and for participating in what amounts to a systematic effort to defraud your wife of her legal rights." Gerald Whitmore's face went white. Dominic's jaw tightened. His blue eyes, which had once made Claire feel like she was the center of the universe, were now ice. Pure, uncut ice. He stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, a reflexive gesture of a man who armors himself with appearance, and said, "You have no idea what you're doing." Danielle met his gaze without flinching. "I've been planning what I'm doing for 6 months, Mr. Ashford. The question is whether you have any idea what you've done." Danielle wasn't finished. Not even close. She told him the rest. She told him that Claire's journal, the one hidden in the hollowed-out copy of Wuthering Heights, had been copied, notarized, and stored in 3 separate secure locations. She told him that the camera footage from the penthouse, which Dominic had installed to monitor Claire, had been downloading to a secure cloud server for months, footage that showed not security concerns, but a pattern of isolation and control that any family court judge in the state would recognize as coercive behavior. She told him that the financial records, the ones he thought were locked away, had been reviewed by a forensic accountant, and that the restructuring he'd told Claire was for the baby's future was, in fact, a systematic transfer of marital assets into structures designed to exclude her. And then she told him the thing that made his face change, really change, not anger, not calculation, something closer to fear. "Claire isn't just your wife, Mr. Ashford. She isn't just the mother of the child she's delivering right now. Claire Whitfield, before she became Claire Ashford, before you convinced her to leave her career, before you systematically cut her off from everyone who cared about her, Claire Whitfield was one of the most talented financial analysts in Charlotte. Her former employer has been in contact with her for the past 2 months. They want her back. They've offered her a senior partnership position with a signing bonus that would make your mother's pearls rattle. This wasn't true, not exactly. Danielle had arranged the contact. She had reached out to Claire's old firm, spoken to the managing partner, explained the situation in broad terms, and the offer had materialized. Because Claire was brilliant. She always had been. Dominic had just made her forget it. She doesn't need you, Danielle said, and her voice was quiet now, almost gentle. The way you speak to someone who is only just beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. She never needed you, and after tonight, you're going to understand exactly how much you needed her. Dominic stood there. The pen was still in his hand. The unsigned pages of the new will were on the desk in front of him. Gerald Whitmore was looking at the formal complaint summary like it was a diagnosis. He didn't want to read. And then Dominic did what men like Dominic always do when the ground shifts beneath them. He got angry. "This is theft," he said. His voice was controlled, but barely. He accessed confidential client files. "You used your position at this firm to do my job," Danielle interrupted. "I'm an estate attorney at this firm, Dip. Ashford Trust is a matter I was assigned to review as part of my professional duties. Everything I've accessed through proper channels. The personal communications were provided to me by Claire, who obtained them from a device that was present in the marital home. And the formal complaint against Mr. Whitmore is based on publicly available legal standards that any first-year law student could identify." She took a step closer. "You wanted to destroy her, Dominic. You wanted to take her baby, take her home, take her money, and leave her with nothing. And you wanted to do it on the night she was lying in a hospital bed, bringing your child into the world." Her voice didn't waver. "That's not going to happen." The silence that followed was the longest 3 seconds of Dominic Ashford's life. He stood in that office, the office where he had come to erase his wife, to reduce her to nothing, to sign away her future with the same casual authority he used to sign business deals, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. No clever argument, no financial leverage, no family name to hide behind, just the slow, sickening realization that he had been outmaneuvered by the one person he had never thought to fear. Dominic looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the desk. His hands were shaking. He didn't look at Dominic. He didn't look at anyone. He looked at the desk and saw, perhaps for the first time in 40 years of unquestioning service, the shape of his own complicity. Neither of them spoke. Daniel picked up the folder. "I'd suggest you get yourself a new attorney, Mr. Ashford, one who isn't facing a bar complaint, and I'd suggest you do it quickly, because Claire's divorce filing will be on your desk by the end of the week." She walked out of the office. She got in her car. She drove to Mercy General Hospital. And she arrived just in time. Claire's daughter was born at 3:22 in the morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. A full head of dark hair and a cry so strong it made the nurses laugh out loud. Claire held her daughter against her chest and felt, for the first time in years, something she had almost forgotten existed. Freedom. Danielle was in the waiting room when Claire's mother arrived. Breathless and tearful and still in her nightgown with a coat thrown over it. They hugged for a long time, and then Danielle went in to see Claire. Claire was exhausted. Her face was swollen. Her hair was matted against her forehead. She was the most beautiful thing Danielle had ever seen. "It's done," Danielle said softly. Claire looked at her. "What happened? I'll tell you everything." But first Danielle looked at the baby, tiny and perfect and blissfully unaware of the storm that had been raging around her. "What's her name?" Claire smiled. It was a real smile. "The first one in months, maybe years." "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." In the days that followed, the Ashford Empire didn't crumble. Empires that size don't crumble overnight. But they cracked. They cracked in ways that Dominic hadn't thought possible. Because he had spent his entire life believing that money could fix anything, and that power meant invincibility. The days between Hope's birth and the formal legal proceedings were strange. Suspended days like the pause between lightning and thunder. When you know the storm has already struck but the sound hasn't reached you yet. Claire stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Her mother slept in the chair beside her bed every night, her hand resting on the edge of Claire's mattress as if proximity alone could protect her. Danielle came every morning with coffee and updates, delivered in the same calm, methodical way. She presented arguments in court. Claire listened. She absorbed. She held hope against her chest and felt the baby's heartbeat against her own. A tiny drumbeat of defiance, of life insisting on itself. Dominique came to the hospital once after the birth. He stood in the doorway of Claire's room holding a bouquet of white roses, expensive, impersonal, the kind of flowers you send to a colleague's funeral. Claire's mother looked at him with an expression that could have peeled paint off walls. Hope was sleeping. Dominic looked at his daughter for perhaps 30 seconds, said something about making arrangements, and left. He didn't hold her. He didn't ask Claire how she was feeling. He was gone within 5 minutes. Claire's mother watched him go and then turned to her daughter with tears in her eyes. "You deserve so much more than that, man," she said. Claire nodded. She already knew. She'd known for months. But hearing it from her mother, the woman who had taught her to read, who had held her face in the driveway and armed her with words that would carry her through a lifetime of storms, hearing it from her made it real, made it permission, made it the starting gun for everything that came next. Asterisk asterisk, the divorce filing landed on Dominic's desk on a Friday morning, hand-delivered by a courier who had been instructed to obtain a signature confirming receipt. Dominic refused to sign. The courier noted this, and it was added to the file. Claire's legal team was formidable. Danielle had recused herself from directly representing Claire. The conflict of interest with her firm made that impossible. But she had personally assembled a team. 3 attorneys from a rival firm that specialized in high-net-worth divorces. A forensic accountant who had once helped the FBI untangle a Ponzi scheme. And a family court advocate who had a reputation for making controlling husbands weep on the witness stand. The prenuptial agreement was challenged first. The argument was straightforward. Claire had not been represented by independent counsel. Gerald Whitmore, who had drafted the prenup, was the Ashford family's attorney. He had a fiduciary duty to the Ashfords, not to Claire. The prenup was voidable. The judge agreed within 2 weeks. The prenup was set aside. With the prenup gone, Claire's claims to marital assets became significant. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means that marital property is divided fairly, not necessarily equally, but fairly. And given the evidence of Dominic's affair, his financial manipulation, his controlling behavior, and his attempt to disinherit his wife on the night of their child's birth, fair was going to look very different from what Dominic had planned. The trust modifications were challenged next. Danielle's documentation showed that several modifications had been made without proper notification to Claire, who was a named beneficiary. This was a violation of the trust's own governance documents. The modifications were reversed. The discovery phase of the divorce was devastating for Dominic. His attorneys, he'd hired a new firm, one of the most expensive in the state, tried to argue that Claire had exaggerated the financial manipulation, that the trust modifications were routine, that the prenuptial agreement had been signed willingly. But Claire's team was prepared for every argument. They had the journal, they had the camera footage, they had the bank records and the forensic accountant's report, which detailed, in excruciating numerical detail, how Dominic had systematically transferred marital assets into structures designed to exclude his wife. They had the messages from the burner phone. They had everything. Dominic's lead attorney, a man named Richard Cole who had a reputation for aggressive litigation, later told a colleague privately that the Ashford case was the most one-sided discovery process he'd ever been part of. It was like walking into a courtroom and finding out the other side had already won, he said. Every piece of evidence they produced was documented, time-stamped, and corroborated. Whoever built that case was a genius. He didn't know it was Danielle. He didn't need to dot, and then the affair came out. Not in court, not at first. It came out the way these things always come out in the world of the very wealthy. It leaked someone, and no one ever confirmed who. Though Dominic's suspicions were loud and legally unfounded, sent copies of the text messages between Dominic and Serena to a local journalist who covered Charlotte's business community. The story ran on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, it was national. By Thursday, Ashford Development Group's board of directors had called an emergency meeting, but the board wasn't concerned about morality. Boards rarely are. They were concerned about optics, about investor confidence, about the 3 major commercial contracts that were currently in negotiation and that depended on the Ashford name being synonymous with trustworthiness and stability. A CEO who cheated on his pregnant wife and tried to steal her inheritance on the night she gave birth was not trustworthy. He was not stable. He was a liability. That Dominic was asked to step down as CEO. He refused. The board voted. The result was unanimous. Dominic Ashford was removed from the leadership of the company his father had built. Victoria Ashford, who had been a silent force behind so much of the manipulation, found herself in a position she had never anticipated, irrelevant. With Dominic removed from the company and the trust modifications reversed, her power evaporated. The trust board, which she had once controlled like a personal fiefdom, was restructured as part of the legal settlement. Independent trustees were appointed. Victoria's role was reduced to that of a beneficiary, nothing more. She tried to fight it. She hired her own attorneys. She made phone calls to old friends in high places, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Victoria Ashford, the matriarch who had treated her daughter-in-law like a disposable vessel, found herself on the outside of the very walls she had built. The divorce was finalized for months after it was filed. The settlement was, by any measure, extraordinary. Claire received full primary custody of Hope. Dominic was granted supervised visitation. Supervised, because the evidence of his controlling behavior and his stated intention to use his family to take custody had convinced the judge that unsupervised access posed a risk. He would see his daughter twice a month, in the presence of a court-appointed monitor, until a subsequent review determined otherwise. Claire received the penthouse, the one where she had been watched by cameras, where her world had been shrunk to the size of Dominic's approval. She walked through it one last time before the sale, alone, in the afternoon light. She stood in the kitchen where she had cooked meals for a man who never thanked her. She stood in the nursery that Victoria had decorated without asking her opinion. She stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, where she had once watched the tiny people below and felt trapped inside glass. She touched the glass with her fingertips, and then she walked out. She didn't look back. She sold it within 3 months and bought a house in Myers Park, a beautiful colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden where Hope could play when she was old enough. She received a financial settlement that reflected her contributions to the marriage and the equitable distribution of marital assets. The judge, in her ruling, included a passage that Claire's legal team would later frame and hang in their conference room. The court finds that Mr. Ashford engaged in a systematic pattern of financial manipulation, emotional coercion, and deliberate concealment designed to deprive his spouse of her legal rights and entitlements. Such conduct not only violates the principles of equitable distribution but offends the fundamental premise upon which marital partnerships are built, trust. The number was significant, but more important than the money was what it represented: acknowledgement that she had been wronged, that the system, for all its flaws, had seen her. Claire went back to work. The offer from her old firm was real by then. Danielle had made sure of it, but Claire earned it on her own merits. She spent the first months focusing on Hope, learning the rhythms of motherhood, the sleepless nights, the impossible tenderness, the way a baby's laugh can demolish every wall you've ever built. Her mother came to stay for a month and taught her the things that can't be learned from books. How to soothe a colicky baby at 3 in the morning, how to trust your instincts when every parenting manual says something different, how to forgive yourself for the days when you feel like you're failing. Claire wasn't failing, she was rebuilding, brick by brick, day by day. She was constructing a life that belonged to no one but her. When the offer from her old firm was formalized, Claire spent a week thinking about it. She sat on her porch one evening, the wrap-around porch she loved, the one that reminded her of houses she'd seen in magazines as a child and never thought she'd own, and she weighed the decision. Going back to work meant leaving Hope with a caregiver during the day. It meant re-entering a world that demanded performance and precision and long hours. But it also meant reclaiming the part of herself that Dominic had tried to suffocate, the part that loved numbers, that saw patterns, that could walk into a room full of men in expensive suits and hold her ground. Without raising her voice, she accepted. She walked into the office on a Monday morning, 6 months after Hope was born, wearing a suit she'd chosen herself, carrying a briefcase that contained her own work, and she sat down at a desk that had her name on it, Claire Whitfield. She'd taken her name back, not Ashford, not Mrs. Anything Whitfield. The name her father had carried into garages and workshops every day for 30 years. The name her mother had written on library cards and Christmas tags. The name she'd been born with, that she'd carried to Duke, that she'd set aside when a man in a perfect suit had convinced her that his name was better. It wasn't. It never had been. Her name was enough. Her name was everything. Danielle was waiting for her when she got home that evening. She was sitting on the porch steps of the new house, holding a bottle of sparkling cider because Claire was still breastfeeding and grinning like they were 18 again. "First day back," Danielle said. "How was it?" Claire sat down next to her. She looked at the sky. It was turning pink and orange. The kind of sunset that makes you believe the world is capable of beauty even after everything you've seen. It was mine, Claire said. It was completely mine. Mine, Danielle repeated, nodding slowly. Yeah, that sounds about right. They sat there for a long time, two women who had held each other up through the best and worst of life, who had made a promise on a rainy graduation day and kept it through years and distance and danger. The cider was too sweet, and the porch steps were hard, and somewhere inside the house, Hope was making the small, fierce sounds of a baby who was going to grow up knowing exactly what strength looked like. Dominic Ashford tried to rebuild. Men like him always try to rebuild. He hired new lawyers. He launched a new business venture. He posted carefully curated photos on social media, photos that showed him looking thoughtful and humble, as though character could be manufactured with the right filter and the right caption. But the world remembered. Investors hesitated. Partnerships fell through. The Ashford name, which had once opened every door in Charlotte, now carried an asterisk. People smiled to his face and whispered behind his back. His mother stopped attending social functions because the looks she received, polite but knowing, were more than her pride could bear. Serena left him. Of course she did. She sent him a text message. After months of whispered promises and heart emojis and plans for our family, telling him she needed space to figure out her own path. The affair had been exciting when Dominic was commanding boardrooms and signing checks that made waiters nervous. It was considerably less exciting when he was toxic, diminished, and drowning in legal fees. She moved to Miami. She didn't look back. Dominic was left alone in a rented apartment because the penthouse was sold. The estate was tied up in trust restructuring, and the lifestyle he'd built was a house of cards that had finally collapsed. He tried to contact Claire once. A letter, handwritten. It arrived at her office, not her home. She'd made sure he didn't have her new address. The letter was 3 pages long, and it was, by all accounts, a masterclass in self-pity disguised as apology. He said he'd made mistakes. He said he'd been under pressure. He said he'd been influenced by his mother. He said he still loved her. He said he wanted to be a better father. Claire read the letter at her desk. She read it once, carefully, the way she read financial statements, looking for what was said, what was unsaid, and what was being hidden between the lines. Then she folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She didn't respond. She went home that evening, and she held Hope, and she cooked dinner in her own kitchen, in her own house. And she felt the kind of peace that doesn't come from winning. It comes from being free, from knowing that the story you're living is finally, truly, yours. Some apologies come too late, not because forgiveness is impossible, but because the person who was wronged has already moved past the need for it. Claire didn't need Dominic's apology. She didn't need his regret. She didn't need him to be a better man. She needed him to be irrelevant. And he was. Hope grew. She had Claire's eyes and Dominic's hair and a temperament that was entirely her own, fierce and curious and unafraid. She took her first steps in the garden of the Myers Park house, reaching for a butterfly that had landed on a rosebud. Claire caught her when she wobbled. Danielle, who was there because she was always there, recorded it on her phone and cried while pretending she wasn't crying. On Hope's first birthday, Claire threw a small party. Her mother came from Raleigh, a few colleagues from work, Danielle, obviously. It was modest and warm and full of laughter. There was a cake that Claire had baked herself lopsided, because baking wasn't her strength, but covered in pink frosting and decorated with the word Hope in slightly uneven letters. That night, after the guests had gone and Hope was asleep and the house was quiet, Claire stood in her kitchen and looked around, at the dishes in the sink, at the half-eaten cake on the counter, at the finger painting on the refrigerator that Hope had made at daycare. A wild explosion of color that could have been a flower, or a dragon, or the Big Bang itself. She thought about the girl she'd been, the one from the clapboard house in Raleigh who had packed her bags and listened to her mother say, "The world is going to try to make you small, don't you let it." She thought about Duke, about Danielle, about the night she'd first seen Dominic, across a crowded gala, and been pulled into an orbit she didn't choose. And she thought about the night, that terrible, beautiful, defining night when her daughter was being born and her husband was trying to erase her, and the woman who had always promised to have her back was standing in a lawyer's office with a folder full of truth and a spine made of steel. She picked up her phone and texted Danielle, just 2 words, "Thank you." Danielle responded immediately, also 2 words, "Always, Claire," and that was enough. That was everything. Because this is what the story is really about. It's not about a man who tried to change a will. It's not about money or custody or legal maneuvering. It's about the fact that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world isn't wealth or influence or a name that opens doors. Sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is a friend who sees you, really sees you, and refuses to let you disappear. Claire Whitfield didn't survive because she was lucky. She survived because she was loved. By a mother who drove 2 hours in a nightgown, by a daughter who didn't know the world yet but who gave her mother a reason to fight for it, and by a best friend who sat in a mahogany-paneled office at 1 in the morning, looked a powerful man in the eye and said, "That's not going to happen." Dominic Ashford learned, in the end, what all men like him eventually learn: you can buy lawyers, you can buy silence, you can buy time, but you cannot buy loyalty. You cannot buy the kind of love that makes someone spend 6 months quietly building a case to save you. You cannot buy the thing that Claire had and Dominic never understood. You cannot buy someone who will hold your hand in the dark and refuse to let go. And Claire learned something too. She learned that being quiet isn't the same as being weak. That trust, when placed in the right hands, is the most powerful weapon there is. That the world will try to make you small through manipulation, through isolation, through the slow, grinding erosion of everything you thought you were, but it only succeeds if you let it. She didn't let it. 3 years later, Claire was named partner at her firm. The announcement made the business section of the Charlotte Observer. There was a photo, Claire standing in the lobby of her office building, smiling, looking every inch like a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Not burned, but forged. Danielle cut out the article and framed it. She hung it in her own office, next to her law degree and a photo of 2 18-year-old girls standing in the rain on graduation day, holding hands, laughing at something the camera couldn't hear. Under the framed article, she wrote a single line in permanent marker, *, I told you she was brilliant. Dominic saw the article too. He was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Southend by then. A dramatic downgrade from the penthouse, though still more comfortable than most people would ever experience. He had started a small consulting firm, nothing like the empire he'd once commanded, but enough to keep him relevant, or so he told himself. He saw Claire's photo in the paper, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt something that wasn't anger or resentment or self-pity. He felt the weight of what he'd lost. Not the money, not the company, her. The woman who had debated a professor at a mixer without flinching. The woman who had made him laugh, really laugh for the first time in years. The woman he had tried to erase because he was too arrogant to see that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He put the paper down. He poured himself a glass of scotch, and he sat in his apartment, alone, with nothing but the sound of traffic and the slow dawning understanding that some mistakes cannot be unmade. Some bridges, once burned, leave nothing but ashes and the memory of what could have been. He had held the pen that night. He had driven across town while his wife was in labor. He had sat in that leather chair and prepared to erase her, and in doing so, he had erased himself from her life, from his daughter's daily world, from the story that would be told about this family for generations to come. He was the villain, he knew it, and knowing it was a punishment more permanent than any court order or financial settlement, because court orders expire, financial settlements are absorbed, but the knowledge that you destroyed the best thing in your life because you couldn't see its value, that stays, that's forever. Hope started preschool that fall. On her first day, Claire knelt down in the hallway of the school, straightened Hope's tiny backpack, and held her daughter's face in both hands, the same way her own mother had held hers in that driveway in Raleigh so many years ago. "The world is going to try to make you small," Claire said, smiling through the tears she couldn't stop. "Don't you let it." Hope looked at her with those serious, beautiful eyes, Claire's eyes, and said, with the absolute certainty of a 3-year-old who doesn't yet know what the world is capable of, "I won't, Mummy." Claire kissed her daughter's forehead. She straightened up. She watched Hope walk through those doors with her tiny backpack bouncing against her back, and she didn't fall apart. She smiled. She waved. She stood there until Hope disappeared around a corner. And then she stood there a little longer, just in case. And then she got in her car, and she drove to work, and she built something. Not for Dominic, not despite Dominic, for herself, for Hope, for every woman who has ever been told she is too small, too quiet, too dependent, too forgettable to matter. Claire believed her daughter. She believed her because she had proof, living, breathing, unshakable proof that the world could try its worst, and some people would still stand. Some people would still fight. Some people would still hold your hand in the dark and refuse, absolutely refuse, to let go. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about karma, though there's certainly karma in it. It's about something older and simpler and more powerful than any legal strategy or financial settlement. It's about a promise. a promise made in the rain between two young women who didn't yet know what the world would ask of them, a promise that was tested by time, by distance, by the kind of betrayal that destroys most people, and a promise that held. Because some promises do, the ones that matter, the ones made by people who mean them. They hold. They hold forever. Some people hear stories like this and they focus on the villain. They focus on Dominic, his arrogance, his cruelty, his spectacular fall. And yes, there's satisfaction in that. There's a primal, undeniable pleasure in watching someone who thought they were untouchable discover that they are not. But that's not the heart of this story. The heart is somewhere else entirely. Danielle never took credit for what she did. When people asked her about the case, and people did ask, because in Charlotte's legal community, the Ashford divorce became legendary, she would deflect. I didn't save Claire. She'd say, Claire saved herself. I just made sure nobody cheated while she was doing it. But that wasn't the whole truth, and everyone who knew the story understood that. Danielle had risked her career. She had walked a razor's edge between professional duty and personal loyalty. She had spent 6 months planning a confrontation that could have destroyed her reputation if it had gone wrong. She did it without hesitation, without complaint, and without ever once making Claire feel like she owed her anything. That's what real love looks like. Not the kind they sell in movies, not the grand gestures and the dramatic speeches. The kind that shows up at 1 in the morning with a folder full of evidence and a refusal to back down. The kind that is quiet and relentless and chooses you, over and over. Even when choosing you is hard. Even when choosing you costs something. So here's what I want you to take from this story. Here's what I want you to carry with you after you close this video. After you go back to whatever your life looks like right now. If you're listening to this story right now, and you have someone in your life like Danielle, someone who sees you, who fights for you, who would sit in a law office at 1 in the morning to make sure you're safe. Hold on to them. Tell them you're grateful. Tell them what they mean to you. Because that kind of love doesn't come around often. It doesn't come around twice. But when it does, it changes everything. Somewhere in Charlotte, in a colonial house with a wraparound porch and a garden full of flowers that a 3-year-old girl helps water every evening, there is a woman who knows this to be true. She knows it in her bones, in her blood, in the name she carries and the name she gave her daughter. She knows it every morning when she wakes up in a bed that is hers, in a house that is hers, in a life that is finally, completely, beautifully hers. Claire still keeps the copy of Wuthering Heights on her nightstand. The journal is gone, submitted as evidence, copied, archived, no longer needed as a secret. But the book remains. She reads it sometimes, late at night, after Hope is asleep. She reads about Catherine and Heathcliff and their doomed destructive love, and she thinks about how different the story might have been if Catherine had had a friend like Danielle. Someone who would have looked at Heathcliff's obsession and said, this isn't love, this is possession, and you deserve better. Maybe that's why the book is still there. Not as a reminder of what she went through, but as a reminder of what she got through. A quiet monument to survival. And if you're the one who's been made small, if someone in your life is trying to erase you, to control you, to convince you that you are less than you are here, you are not small. You are never small. And the people who try to make you small are the ones who are terrified of how big you really are. Claire Whitfield proved that, on a night when the world was falling apart. When her body was breaking open to bring new life into existence, when the man who had promised to love her was signing papers to destroy her, she proved it, not with anger, not with vengeance, not with a dramatic confrontation or a cinematic speech. With trust, with patience, with the quiet, fierce, unshakable belief that the truth would come out, that justice would come, and that the people who loved her would not let her fall. They didn't, they never did, and in the end, that was all she needed.